Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our podcast. I am Kelly Birmingham, and this is a 25-year look across the spectrum. This podcast was designed during the pandemic, like all podcasts were, to look at my 25, now 28 years in the field, working with children and adults with autism and developmental disabilities, and taking topics related to autism and really fleshing them out from a BC-based perspective and a caregiver's perspective, which is really unique and unusual. So with us always is my partner in crime, Jen Lucero, mother to Dylan and Ethan. Hi, Jen.
Hey, Kelly.
If people don't know, Jen, tell people real quick about Dylan and Ethan. How old is Dylan and Ethan?
Sure. So Dylan is 24 and he is a great guy and he lives on the autism spectrum. And my youngest, Ethan, is 22, graduated from college almost a year ago already,
Wow.
and is living in Santa Cruz. And I work for, I'm the director for Special Olympics Southern California and used to work for Autism Speaks as well. So been kind of like you guys are just talking, doing it a long time.
Long time. And I've known Dylan since he was nearly 4. So we've been
Mhm.
together and friends for
20
20
years.
years. Very close aligned together for 20 years. Before we dive into our podcast, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, SitePro. SitePro offers a wide range of engaging and practical continuing education courses developed by BCBAs for BCBAs. You can visit their website at sitepro.com to see the complete CU library, including all of our podcasts free. So you free on demand, driving along, going somewhere, pop us in and give us a listen and get free CEUs. So our last podcast, Jen, you and I were talking about quality of life. We talk about it all the time. We started this podcast talking about quality of life from a caregiver perspective. And we've always said, and we've had multiple caregivers come on as guests and say the top 3 things they think about with quality of life is the first one is always safe, right? Second one is healthy. Third one is happy.
Mhm.
Fourth one is having like a community and being able to be as inclusive in their community as possible. And then the families and the child having a tribe, right? Like
Mhm. For
people in their
sure.
life that are there for them and looking out for them. Our last podcast, we talked about quality of life as a factor for exercise. I'm sorry, quality of life is for leisure skills and recreational skills, and how you had really worked to get Dylan fully included in his community, despite the fact that he's pretty profoundly impacted, as it will, on the spectrum. So today we have an expert in the topic. You and I just joke around and talk quality of
Mhm.
life, right? But we have an expert in this topic, and we get to have Meghan Herron, who is the director of research at Autism at Easterseals, where I work and where Dylan goes for his day program.
Mhm.
And Meghan is also a BCBA. She's been in the field nearly 20 years. She has a personal affiliation on the spectrum. And I have had the pleasure of speaking alongside her and heard her talk about the research she's doing around quality of life. And so I asked her to come here to like dumb it down for us and talk about the work she's done. Hi, Meghan.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Will you take like just a couple minutes and tell our listeners like who you are and what you do? Like, how did you make research your career?
Sure. Well, I started, as many of us do in the field, as a behavior technician working in homes, providing ABA services. And I got my start professionally at UC Santa Barbara with the Kegel Autism Consultant Center. I
Cool.
got trained in PRT, working primarily with play-based interventions, increasing communication. And what sparked that interest initially finding out about that opportunity was that my younger brother is on the spectrum as well.
Mhm.
So most of my life I was, seeing firsthand what life is like behind the scenes, or how autism impacts everyone, not just the individual, but the whole family as well, and the whole unit. So as far as research, I I love the science of ABA. I love the science of research. I love data. I love spreadsheets. I love graphs. I'm one of those people. So I do have my freak in the sheets sticker, my Excel logo. Um, but I share with people that how I know that research is really the passion that I have, was an experience I had being in a clinical trial for a medication when I was about 9, 10 years old, and telling the doctor that I believed I was in the control group because I didn't see my scores changing. And it turned out to be correct. I had been given a placebo. So just kind of, my brain always thinks that way, is how can we set this up as a study?
That's awesome.
I
Freaking,
promise I'm fun too.
freaking the sheets. That's hysterical. Well, so just for our listeners, because they've heard Jen and I talk about this before, if they follow us, there are a couple of organizations who people are trying to measure quality of life, right? I know many, many people that are trying to do this. I know that if anyone follows ICHOM, which puts together sets of standards of care internationally, they put together I always butcher this, QCL2, Tom Grazier's form for quality of life, and they say use that. Great form, fine, but I don't know that it's going to get what we're looking for. Easterseals does something totally different, which when I went down the rabbit hole of quality of life a few years ago, I found this out, which made me really interested in talking about quality of life at Easterseals. So would you tell people what tool that Easterseals use and maybe describe it a little bit? And I specifically mean the kid screen.
Sure. So we often get that question, considering how many different tools there are out there for quality of life. How did we land on the kid screen? And we started this project as a in-depth literature review. And some of the questions we had were, of course, what tools exist to measure quality of life, and some other practical considerations like age, because quality of life is very different from a child than it is for an adult. And also for specific conditions. We are working primarily with individuals with autism or intellectual disabilities. So it was important for us to know that these tools were going to be reliable and valid for the population that we serve. And that was kind of the other big question, was what we call psychometrics. So reliability is a way that we can see how consistently a tool is when it's measuring certain components. And then the validity just means that it's measuring what it's supposed to. And there's a bunch of fancy calculations that can be done, a bunch of different ways broken down that I'm bored by. So I will just give you the basics, and that's what we're looking for. So we did come up in the research with a few different tools. At least I'll stick with the children's ones for now, that came up frequently. So not only did they have good psychometrics, meaning they were well-developed tools that measure what they're supposed to, but they were used commonly in research, also with an autism population. So we know that they can be used with an autism population. What we did find across the board was that all of these tools were in some way interview or questionnaire based. So the kid screen, for example, it has a long form. It's 54 items. It takes a little while to administer. And what a lot of these tools, the process that these companies go through, or organizations who make them, is they'll have their typical long form, and then they will find a way to make a brief form. So they'll make it shorter, and they try to find, or most useful. Sometimes they even have a really, really brief form, which the kid screen does. So at Easterseals, we use the middle one, the brief form, which is called the kid screen 27.
Yep.
So there's 27 items on there, and they're broken into 5 different domains. I don't have them off the top of my head, but incorporating things like physical health, socialization, or interpersonal relationships, their living situation, transportation that they have access to, things like that, the type of support that they're receiving. So they really try to include a variety of domains that would be relevant for children.
I will argue all fit into our 5 categories. Like our 5 categories are like global categories. And when I learned about the kid screen, I'm like, oh, that like gets into the depth of the 5 categories, the broad categories, right?
Right. So we started that project where we wanted to include something like quality of life with our services as an outcome measure. So you've probably mentioned it in past episodes, but quality of life has been around a long time. It's something that's been of interest to, different healthcare fields, and it's been explored and used in a variety of settings, but it is sort of fairly new to ABA and autism.
Yes.
So part of the projects we've looked into and research that we've done, quality of life really is not being included as an outcome measure for ABA
Mhm.
services or many autism services in general, whether that's different types of therapies or special education. And through the project, we've kind of found to see why, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying. So, our typical outcome measures that we really commonly see with ABA and autism services center around IQ type tests, developmental
Mhm.
assessments, sometimes different experiences like school placement if they are
Mhm.
mainstreamed or if they're in a special day class, etc. But we really don't see anything qualitative, especially something that is as much as possible a perspective of the client themselves. So that's kind of
Mhm.
our big goal with doing this.
So
Awesome.
before we get into, I want you to talk about like a brief, not, we didn't need the statistics, but a little bit about the outcome of like the work that you did is based on what she said, Jen, like, IQ, school placement,
Mhm.
that kind of thing for quality of life. How does that match up as a parent? Do you care about
Yeah.
those things?
Well, I mean, I think we instinctively know where they're at, obviously, and are living it. For me, I've always kind of focused more on the idea of Dylan's quality of life and the five aspects that from day one that
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about. And most of my concerns were, it wasn't about, IQ, things like that, or the school placement or the services. It was, very deep on, is like safety to this day is still one of my number ones, it's like,
Yes.
things like that, or his health, things like that. So,
And
um,
happiness.
and happiness. And it is hard, in testing Dylan has always been a real struggle. And it always took almost like a whole tribe and team just to get through the test because he couldn't verbally answer questions. So, I mean, it's always really interesting to me to hear that, but to also seeing people like acknowledge it, that, there's different ways to conduct studies to try to really find out what the best outcome is going to be for the individual.
Actually, that's something Megan talks about quite a bit, and we're going to
Mhm.
get to that part
Mhm.
for sure. Megan, will you talk a little bit about the study and the results that you found?
Yeah, so we have just started sort of our preliminary analysis on this based on the data we have accessible. So we rolled this out as a project company wide where we started first collecting or administering these quality of life assessments during our intake assessment period. So as soon as we get those initial referrals for our clients, our clinicians are running a quality of life assessment. And we came up upon our first annual point. So we did decide that these were going to be administered annually, along with some of the other developmental assessments that we do. So we started pulling some of those data to see if we can initially see, is there a difference between clients' quality of life after 12 months? So if we compare that intake score with the score that they're providing 12 months later, are we seeing a difference?
Mhm.
And the results we got with this preliminary analysis did not surprise me. There was no statistically significant difference, which is kind of what I expected to see. But the important part, I think, was the why and pulling
Mhm.
additional data where we might be able to see where that's coming from, because it sounds really discouraging. What's
Mm-hmm.
the point of doing 12 months worth of this intensive intervention if it's not even showing a difference? So one of those points was that timing wise, from when we administer at the intake versus 12 months later, that's not 12 months of service, because that incorporates that whole intake assessment period, plus getting,
Mhm.
the schedule together and all of that. So the average was actually about 7.5 months of service.
Okay.
They're not getting 12 months at that point. So that's already almost broken down to half of the time of actually getting that service. But the other thing we were looking at was what other variables might impact this, or there might be a correlation with. So we do have another component that generally we know impacts outcomes, which is the service hours that they're getting, or the intensity level. So we did have access to the total number of hours that those clients had received, but we're still working on configuring our system to pull more data out, because what we really want to look at is not just the total hours of service, but the percentage of their recommended hours.
Right.
There's going to be a big difference, you know, between someone who's receiving 20 hours because they needed 20 hours versus someone who's getting 7 hours when they needed 20. That's going to have a very different impact on quality of life. But the other big important component is that quality of life is a molar view. It's big picture. These assessments are not designed to be cut and paste goals for the individuals that that our clinicians are working with. So we can't look at a quality of life assessment and say, okay, well, your scores in the socialization domain are low. Let's directly work on those. We're not teaching to the test here. So that's one of the big barriers that we're encountering with that.
So the average BCBA listening, right? New to this topic, how would they program with quality of life in mind? And could they potentially use like a short form kid screen themselves?
A cool thing about Kidscreen and some of the other quality of life assessment tools that are used, like ones for adults as well, many of them are free to use in organizations who create them. So they're quite easy to administer. The organizations will give you the manual, all of that. So this is something that BCBAs can do, even if their organization doesn't have a procedure for it. They are available to do that. And you may notice looking at them and the different items that a lot of it makes sense that you couldn't just use that as a goal, because it's not an observable behavior. And because these are all perspective based, you know, we're asking individuals how satisfied they feel with some domain of their life. So, you know, we can ask them, are you satisfied with the, number of friends that you have? And they may say yes when they have no friends, but that's what quality means to them, or they have one friend. Others may answer differently because they want lots of friends. It's very individualized. So that's part of it too, where you should be able to look at the items and it should remind you, okay, I'm not supposed to cut and paste this. But again, then what do you do? So what you can look at are the different domains and seeing, are these low across the board? Are there particular domains that are noticeably lower than others? And we know from research that we've done that is very common across a variety of tools that individuals with autism are reporting their quality of life to be lower than people who do not have autism.
Definitely. Research definitely shows us that.
Absolutely. So what likely can be done is, if you notice there's certain domains that are low or maybe lower than others, that can spark a conversation. So I like to use the socialization or interpersonal relationships example, because it's so common that one is lower than even the others for people with autism who are on the spectrum. So that might mean that it's a good time to have a conversation with that client, or solicit more information from them in any way that you can, to see if you can better define what a quality social life looks like for that individual, and talk more about what specific goals could be introduced to help them meet that goal. And it's going to be different for different clients.
I love that, because that's what I sort of joke around that I'm the opposite of a researcher, by the way, which is why when you talk, I'm just like bow down to you. But I'm like the practical trainer. Like, it's all in my head, and I'm just like, all right, let's just get down and dirty and get it done, right? And so in my head, I'm looking like, can I look at the domain topics, right? See where they're low, like you just said, and then start talking about like, why is that low? And so you just said my word. So I'm like, whew, okay, I was doing it right. Because
Definitely.
people know, if they know me, I do a lot of training and talking about safety and how important safety is. Because if you're not alive, there's no quality of life.
Right.
Like, I wrote an article in the textbook about it. Like, if you're not physically alive, you don't have a quality of life. And some of that's influenced by Jen, because Dylan, safety's been one of your number one things, because he's run out. I mean, I've known several children who have been killed on the autism spectrum who eloped and got hit by vehicles, right? And I know safety for you, Jen, is number one. So for people listening, a takeaway is they could go get this tool and they could use it to like have conversations to start programming based on the domains. Is that fair to say, Megan?
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, let's talk about how it's used. Like it's an interview style and the questioning, right? There's barriers for that. I know, like that's going to be a barrier for Jen's son, Dylan. So can we talk about that?
Right. Yeah. So these formalized tools that we're pulling from the research are pretty much exclusively either interview or questionnaire based. So some of them are a little bit more open-ended, but most are questionnaire based where there's some type of Likert scale. So something from strongly disagree all the way up through strongly agree, with different statements that are included as the items. And this is a particularly difficult when we are talking about populations where communication may be significantly delayed or there's a significant deficit there. Or even if it's not necessarily communication, auditory processing can be an issue. If they can't read it themselves and we need to read it to them, but that's a challenge. There's just a variety of barriers there as far as being able to get the client's opinion. There are some alternative methods with this type of administration. So there is a proxy response form that many include.
Tell
And
people what proxy means if they don't know.
yes, so the it's usually called a caregiver proxy response form, and it means that we are asking the caregiver to respond in the way they think their child would, which is obviously different from their own perspective. So they're, putting themselves in their child's shoes and thinking, I think that his, social quality of life is really low, but I don't think he would agree. He seems pretty happy with, just having a few close friends and, not having birthday party or whatever it is that that caregiver is thinking. It still is a barrier because with some of the tools we've looked at the research for, the reliability, meaning the level of agreement between what the client says themselves and what their caregiver says as a proxy is not always very good. Some of them, it's decent, it's okay, but for some of the tools, it was so low, it was lower than chance. So the caregiver could have just guessed and gotten a better response, which tells us that this is not really the best option for getting information directly from clients. So more work needs to be done here.
Right? Like, could Dylan answer a Likert scale question, do you think, Jen?
No, I think but and not just where he is now, but he's had the test done before, and sometimes he just walks out, or he will like grab your hand and take you to the door and be like, goodbye.
Yeah, I was just gonna say bye. That's what he says.
Yeah. Or just his attention span, like just in general for any sort of questions. He might answer a few and then he just kind of checks out. So yeah, I think it would be very difficult I've done several as a caregiver and a parent and now as the conservator, but again, it's kind of, you actually just said kind of how it flows where I answer how I think he would, and Dylan's interesting because I do think he is, what Kelly and I talk about all the time. I do think overall he's most of the time happy. There's definitely some non-preferred activities, like, some stuff coming up even this weekend, but overall, I think, he's pretty happy of where he's at in the world right now. Yeah. I hope anyways.
Tell me, and poor Jen, she has to have like these gut-wrenching conversations with me because when I was there the other day, I swear he looked a little sad. I don't know if you thought that, like, and I totally was projecting myself all over him because I missed him and I was so happy to be there. And so I'm like holding his hand and I'm like, he looks right. And I'm like so happy just to be next to him. But like for people like listening, how do you know he's like, you don't know, right? But if you were to say, like, I think he's pretty happy, what do you observable behaviors you see in him that make you think that he's pretty happy?
He makes certain squeals and noises like when he's happy. Definitely like physical music movements. He does like this
happy dance
little thing we call the happy dance. He he's kind of a jokester in his own way. So if he's happy and there's people over that he likes, he'll go give them like noogies, things like that, or would just do silly things. And then he, a lot of times I know he's thinking about something positive in his head because he kind of just, it's like an inside joke. He just starts laughing hysterically and stuff. So there's signs definitely that he's happy.
And there's
there's-
more of those than not.
yes, I'd say majority.
And so Megan, I always go down a rabbit hole on all of this, right? And so like,
Mhm.
you know, you might not have more of those if you don't feel well, right? And if you're not
Mhm.
safe, which that's been Dylan's profile a lot. And I know it's
Mhm.
my stepdaughter's profile, but I know, I don't know if you want to share, we're kind of playing around with that cool study at Easterseals called Indices of Happiness for folks that are nonverbal. Do you want to just share like a little bit about like the study we're kind of talking about replicating?
Yeah, so this really came out of some of these limitations that we found with the quality of life assessment tools. And on this same topic, where it's important to get the level of satisfaction self-report perspective, but for those populations where this is just not a good fit, we wanted something else, or something perhaps more observable or clear. So some of these studies started 30, 40 years
Yeah.
ago.
Yep. Read and
And
breathe.
and they're referred to as indices of happiness, just meaning observable behaviors that indicate someone's happy. So things like smiling and laughing. And but what I love about what Jen said was that it's very specific to individuals. And even in some of the studies we're looking at, they had different charts and tables for the participants and what their indices of happiness were. I think probably all of us have had a situation, or many in our lives, where we did like an awkward, uncomfortable laugh.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Sure, we're laughing, but we're laughing because if we don't, we're going to cry.
Right.
Mhm.
Topographically, it's the same. It's a laugh, but it doesn't mean happiness all the time. Um,
Mhm.
and there's some individuals on the spectrum who, display poor regulation of emotion. So you may see them hysterically laughing, and they're not happy.
Mhm.
Or the opposite. They may be crying and nothing. You ask them, "What's wrong?" "I don't know. I feel fine."
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
how do we tease that out?
it's hard. What some of these initial studies did was they interviewed caregivers.
Yeah.
Jen gives a great example of how just living with her son, she knows.
Mm-hmm.
She knows what happy dance means. She and I bet you could tell the difference between something that, between a happy smile or an uncomfortable smile.
Mhm.
Like, as a parent, you can tell. It's hard to write it down and describe it, but when you know,
Yeah.
which is not a
Right.
very research thing to
Yeah,
say.
absolutely.
It's a vibe, right?
Well, and sometimes he has key words when he is not happy,
True.
or he wants he thinks thinking about, taking you out or something, and then he'll say something, and usually it's across the room. Like before, when I was younger, it'd just be immediate, like I'm gonna react and I'm gonna have a tantrum and something's gonna happen, either. But now he'll say things like which are seem to other people like super strange, but are just funny. When I'm like, uh-oh,
Yep.
like they'll start singing like on top of spaghetti all covered with cheese, and that is not good. Or like shout out like a title of a movie, and I'm like he yells Mamma Mia when he's mad. And like I know he's thinking about stuff, or but now he can self-regulate. So he can either talk himself out of it, or I can be like, no, we're not going to do that. And then he'll ask for something, like for me to set a timer or something. It will be very specific. I'm like, how much time do you need? And he's like 4 minutes. And I'll set it like on the kitchen clock, and he'll go stare at it for 4 minutes, and he's just, and then he calms down. But it's taken years.
Yeah.
But again, there's this stuff like instinctually. But I do have a great team overall, and people always, like, if they don't know, and like they will ask questions. And now a lot of people, we almost call it like the Dylan language. Everybody is like adapting to know what these things mean.
My brother sings Michael Jackson, Leave Me Alone.
Oh, there you go.
My stepdaughter just says, go the fuck away. Sorry.
There you go.
I mean, that one works too.
Yeah.
Well, this was fantastic, Megan. When you talk, I'm like fangirl over just
Yeah,
hearing you talk on all of
amazing.
this. It's like a topic I've been working on, like going down rabbit holes for years and years. So I feel like anyone listening can like have a tool they could reference, right, on their own. They could know like not to cut and paste, but like use it as a dialogue, look at scores to like see where you're going to look at, and then work with the families as like, tell us like if someone can't answer the questions, like what do you see as these like indices of happiness, and then start to like, you can start to measure when they happen, how often, are there more of them than not, kinds of things. And you can at least get some measure or start to look at quality of life as an outcome of ABA services.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you guys so much. This is
Thank
fantastic.
you. Thank you, Megan.
Megan, you are brilliant. I am your biggest fan. Thanks for joining us.
Let's go to my head.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.